In this video, we will talk about conceptualization of dyslexia, how we conceive of dyslexia, and we will do that in terms of how it is defined and what that implies. So first of all, why do we need to define dyslexia? One possible reason for defining something is to express our understanding. When we know what something is and isn't, then we can provide a definition that clearly separates these cases and accurately classifies anyone into the appropriate group. In other cases, we may need a definition because we don't have an understanding, because there are ambiguities, conflicts, and disagreements, and we need to provide a working definition so that people may make decisions that are practically necessary. In this case, when there is a practical need for classification in order to provide or not provide special education services. Let us consider the possibility of understanding. In the case of dyslexia, this has been discussed extensively, and relatively recently, Elliott and Grigorenko, in their highly acclaimed book, The Dyslexia Debate, provide a list of different understandings of dyslexia that they find in the literature or in praxis. So, a dyslexic may be considered as anyone who struggles with accurate single word decoding. Some people may believe that it is only the accuracy of decoding individual words that is a defining characteristic of dyslexia. Others may conceive of dyslexia as a more pervasive syndrome, and in these cases, decoding is just one of many elements, or one of a range of symptoms that may include various things like motor coordination, math skills, language, visual skills, even low self-esteem, that these are all defining features of dyslexia. Others take a more instrumental approach, for example, looking for a discrepancy between different kinds of assessments, a discrepancy between decoding performance and IQ, or between decoding and listening comprehension. And there are other approaches that highlight specific kinds of difficulties that aren't in reading tasks, but in supposedly underlying cognitive processes. So there is a huge range of different understandings of what dyslexia is, of who may be considered to be dyslexic, as outlined here by Elliott and Grigorenko. So it seems that the idea that we defined because we understand is probably not the right one. In fact, Elliott and Grigorenko concluded that although it is incontrovertible that there is a significant number of individuals who struggle to learn to read, meaning to decode, for reasons other than poor teaching, and this condition is widely known as dyslexia, it has not been possible to achieve a clear, scientific, and consensual understanding of this term. Therefore, in other words, there is no understanding. So that is not why we are trying to define dyslexia. However, there are practical needs. One need concerns research, and that has to do with a constant definition that is widely accepted so that researchers can agree on who gets studied and what they measure, what is relevant. So the definition acts as a filter that constrains research and provides the context for research into dyslexia. In education, definition dictates who receives remedial services. So whoever falls within the definition is eligible for special education services. And in addition, the definition provides guidance regarding what should be assessed and what should be targeted in intervention. One element that is obvious across dyslexia definitions in decades has to do with the notion of unexpectedness. So that there is a reading failure, reading outcomes are not satisfactory, and that is unexpected. What does it mean to be unexpected? When is poor reading outcome unexpected? One source of expectation may have to do with age and experience. So unexpected for a given age and unexpected based on experiences such as learning instruction. Age in itself is related to maturation, including maturation of linguistic skills. And for example, this has to do with the fact that a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old cannot learn to read because they're not expected to have achieved the necessary level of meta-linguistic awareness. Experience has also to do with practice. A child who has not tried to learn to read and hasn't practiced reading is not expected to be able to read. Sensory perception is also relevant here in terms of expectation because you cannot expect someone to read if they cannot see well. They have to be able to see the letters, or someone who cannot hear because hearing impairment is detrimental to phonological development. Actually, it's not possible to have phonological representations for your spoken language if you cannot hear the language. Educational opportunity is also critical. We cannot expect someone to be able to read if they have not been taught to read. Indeed, taught to read with an instructionally appropriate approach. So they need to have been going to school or have other interactions that are relevant for this and have received an appropriate amount and kind of literacy instruction. Another source of expectation that was used in the past but is no longer considered relevant is general cognitive ability. This justifies some previous definitions of dyslexia that concerned a discrepancy between, for example, decoding and IQ. It was previously believed that one's reading achievement is based on their general intellectual functioning. In other words, that people with higher IQ are expected to be better decoders, and people with lower IQ are expected to be worse decoders. So you wouldn't be called dyslexic. It wouldn't be unexpected for someone with low IQ to have reading problems. This is no longer the case, as we will see in a bit. Earlier definitions have typically included a variety of additional components. For example, a definition from the Orton Dyslexia Society, which is now the International Dyslexia Association. So in 1994, the definition that they provided included a bunch of terms like distinct, specific, constitutional, language-based, associated with insufficient phonological processing, affecting single word decoding, difficulty with different forms of language, affecting writing and spelling. In general, there were a lot of components that were included in the dyslexia definition, and these were of different kinds. Some were very strong theoretical hypotheses, and others were simply observations of co-occurrence. This amount of information was typical for the 90s, but we are now moving toward leaner definitions of dyslexia that focus on just the most essential elements. So let us now turn to the evolution of how we conceptualize development. I'm going to be contrasting elements of dyslexia definitions between the past and the future, and then I will contrast their implications for research and education. Let us first go through the different elements themselves and how they have evolved or are now in the process of evolving. I'm going to start with elements that are already evolved for the most part and go toward things that are not yet changed in the minds of many, but are in the process of change, at least in my opinion. The first element in dyslexia conceptualization, and one that has actually been resolved, concerns the issue of discrepancy from IQ. So it was previously believed that you cannot be dyslexic unless your decoding is much worse than we would expect from your IQ. This is no longer accepted for a number of reasons. For example, that the IQ is not strongly predictive of decoding, and that differences in IQ do not predict differences in intervention or outcomes of intervention. So now researchers agree that dyslexia can exist across ranges of ability. So over the whole spectrum of IQ, it is possible to have dyslexia. IQ is not relevant to the diagnosis or the definition. A second element that has evolved for the most part is that dyslexia was often seen as an assortment of different symptoms, of which reading was just one symptom. And this has changed, and researchers and most practitioners now agree that dyslexia just concerns word level processing, concerns the ability to decode. So it is specific to literacy at the word level. And the other symptoms or whatever else may be thought to be associated with it has no place in the definition or diagnosis of dyslexia. In previous conceptualizations, dyslexia was thought of as a problem with single word decoding, individual words. We now think of it a bit more broadly, although we're still firmly within the word level of processing. But when we say word reading difficulty, this allows us to include not just single words, but also word sequences. Moving on to slightly more theoretical issues, dyslexia was seen as a discrete and identifiable condition. So there was a qualitative difference. Dyslexia was a condition. You either had it or not. In contrast, dyslexia is now seen by researchers as continuous with the general population. This means that we accept there is a large range of reading performance, and we choose a percentage at the low end, and we call them dyslexic, and that reflects our arbitrary cutoff criterion as much as it reflects their performance. So there's nothing discrete identifiable about being dyslexic. Related to the idea of a discrete condition was the idea of a discrete cause. So it was previously thought, and some researchers still believe, that dyslexia is caused by some factor. They don't agree on which factor, so each researcher or group proposes their own factor, but there are many who still believe that dyslexia is caused by something X. And that factor accounts for all the observations that have to do with dyslexia. In contrast, many researchers are now abandoning this view and turning toward multifactorial and multi-level polygenic models. So focusing on the interactions and effects of many different factors at many different levels, from genetic through neural and cognitive to behavioral. Related to this idea of a specific cause is the idea that dyslexia is caused by your genes. This is different from the specific X factor, but it's similar in that people who believe that dyslexia is predetermined by the genes also must imply that it is fixed once and for all because you cannot change the genes. Instead, if you take the multifactorial and multi-level approach, then you do not consider dyslexia as something that is present at birth because it's just your genes, but you take into account that the genes are expressed in an environment leading to a developmental trajectory that is also susceptible to noise and how that interacts with the environment. So there is a complex trajectory that eventually determines the outcome. It's not fixed by the genes. Moving on to the conceptualization, dyslexia has been considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. Many researchers are still considering this idea. What does it mean to be a neurodevelopmental disorder? It means that something in the development of the brain is wrong. Something went wrong as the brain was wiring itself, and that has caused the reading problems. In contrast to this approach, other researchers prefer to conceive of dyslexia as being within normal variability, especially as there is no evidence of any actual abnormality in individual brains of dyslexic children. And this leads us to the final contrast between the older conception that sees dyslexia as a natural category. So someone is either dyslexic or isn't dyslexic. That is already present as a defining feature of this person and doesn't even have to depend on being taught to read. So someone can be dyslexic before they are taught to read, and when they are taught to read, then the dyslexia causes them to have trouble reading. That is the traditional conception, and many people, including perhaps many practitioners, ascribe to this view. In contrast to this view, what I think is the more modern approach is to think of dyslexia as an educational label that is applied to those who have been instructed to read and have failed to achieve a satisfactory level of performance. So you cannot be dyslexic before you're taught to read. This would make no sense to say. You are dyslexic if you have failed to respond to appropriate literacy instruction. Let us now consider the implications of the evolution of each of these elements for research and for education. The first element concerned IQ. If you believe that dyslexia is present only if your IQ is higher than your decoding ability, then as a researcher, you will ignore children who have below average IQ. So you will not use them in your studies because they're not dyslexic according to this. But if you accept that dyslexia, so specific problems with learning to read, are possible across all levels of IQ, then children with low IQ will be included in the studies and will be part of what is studied when we study dyslexia. Children with very low IQ will probably not be included because we will not be certain that these children can respond to the demands of testing in the same way as other children. So there is usually a criterion for study participation that has an IQ cutoff. But this does not concern a discrepancy. It is an absolute criterion that has to do with the ability to participate in the research and carry out the tasks as intended. For education, the approach that considered dyslexics only those who were discrepant from IQ essentially excluded all children with below average IQ who had reading problems, and they received no special education services. So they received no support for their reading. Fortunately, this has changed, as it is now understood that IQ doesn't have anything to do with dyslexia, and recognizing dyslexia across IQ ranges has the benefit that everyone who has a reading problem can receive special education interventions. Moving on to the next element, conceiving of dyslexia as composed of a bunch of symptoms will tempt researchers to try and find what is common behind all those symptoms. So researchers will focus on mapping the various symptoms and try to find their common source. In contrast, if we forget about the symptoms that have nothing to do with reading and are widely heterogeneous anyway, and focus on just where the problem is, the only thing that is common among children with dyslexia, namely word level processing problems, then we will be studying just reading skill and the causes of different levels of reading skill and the developmental trajectories leading to these reading outcomes. For education, looking at dyslexia as an assortment of various symptoms will cause you to try and address a variety of symptoms that have nothing to do with the reading problem, or to consider that some of these issues make reading improvement impossible. In contrast, if you focus on the only defining feature that is word level processing, then assessment and intervention will concentrate on the profile that is related to reading. What is the current level of reading skill? Are the prerequisites for that reading skill fulfilled? And where do we need to start intervening in order to build the necessary foundation for improving that reading skill? And all the other supposed symptoms become completely irrelevant. If we believe that dyslexia is only when you have a problem with single word decoding, that is going to lead researchers to essentially just measure reading accuracy. Indeed, many researchers have been doing that for decades, and they have been defining their groups on the basis of just measures of word reading accuracy. And so we are missing a whole lot of information from other very relevant elements of the reading profile. Fortunately, this has been changing, although much more slowly in the English-speaking world. In the other languages, all the other orthographies are more transparent, so it's obvious that accuracy is not the major issue. So researchers have realized that dyslexia doesn't just concern word decoding and indeed just single words. It concerns also the efficiency of decoding word sequences. So there is a strong drive that perhaps has started from research in other languages and is now slowly catching on in the English-speaking languages that considers both accuracy and fluency as word-level reading outcomes. Similarly, for education, if you think that dyslexia is just a problem with the accuracy of single word decoding, then the target for intervention will be to improve that, and will be considered successful when the child begins to read individual words correctly. But that is not appropriate because a child may still be completely disfluent, may be able to read individual words accurately, but very slowly, so that the child will not actually be able to carry out a literacy task leading on to learning from reading, to read with sufficient fluency that they can learn from reading and enjoy reading. So seeing dyslexia for the word level reading difficulty, including fluency, has the immediate implication for education that intervention should also target fluency. What about the discreteness of the situation? If you think that dyslexia is a discrete identifiable condition, then you will reasonably devote your research efforts in defining diagnostic criteria that will be able to clearly separate that condition. If it's discrete and identifiable, we should be able to discretely identify it. If, like we now believe, dyslexia is not a discrete identifiable condition, but in fact continues with the general population, then we don't expect to find such clear-cut criteria. We accept that criteria are arbitrary cutoffs, and instead, we focus on characterizing performance profiles. We're not looking for clear separating lines, but we're trying to understand what are the differences in the performance profiles at different points along the distribution. For education, if you believe that is an identifiable condition, you will expect clear cutoff criteria and you will want to apply your criteria in an unambiguous manner. If you realize that there is continuity, then you realize that the choices are actually multifactorial. There is no clear-cut line to separate who has dyslexia and who doesn't. So the choice of providing services to whom and what kind of services is actually multifactorial. That requires to think of multiple different factors and take context into account. If you believe that dyslexia is caused by a specific identifiable factor, one that is behind everything within the dyslexic profile, then it is an obvious research goal to search for that X. Try to find the cause of dyslexia. If instead you realize that there is no such single specific factor, but dyslexia is just the outcome of a multifactorial, multi-level, and polygenic route, a trajectory of development that is determined by interactions among all of these factors at all of these levels, then the goal of research is no longer to search for distinct causes, but becomes to understand how these pathways of development evolve, how they are determined, and how they can be steered into different directions. So for education, if you think that X causes dyslexia, it is normal to try and fix X instead of working with reading. So there have been dyslexia programs aimed at fixing one's balance or vision or hearing, essentially auditory processing or other kinds of things, and expect that reading will improve by intervention in these domains. All of these have failed because dyslexia isn't caused by any X. So understanding that dyslexia is the multiply determined outcome of complex developmental trajectories, then you must focus on how reading itself develops. And you must create and apply interventions that build on the current state of strengths of each individual child and lead toward trajectories toward better reading outcomes. When we think about the genes and the idea that dyslexia might be determined by the genes, which means that it's fixed actually not at birth, but at conception, then researchers will conceive of dyslexia as something that is fixed, it's stable. If it's present at conception, then that cannot be altered. What can we do? We might seek cures of some sort, or we might look for ways to support individuals around their fixed problem. However, if we conceive of dyslexia as the outcome of a developmental trajectory, of course, strongly constrained by genes, but not only by genes, then the focus of researchers is not going to be to try and invent cures or workarounds. The focus of research is going to be to find what changes in the environment can be used to steer this development away from the negative literacy outcomes. So the implications for education here are dramatic. If you think the problem is fixed, you're either looking for some cure, unlikely, miracle cures are going to be advertised here, or you're going to be looking at ways to circumvent the problem. So try to compensate. And crucially, it doesn't matter when, because if the problem is fixed at conception and you're not actually intervening on the problem, then you can apply your workaround whenever it is convenient. But if you see dyslexia as an outcome of a developmental trajectory, and you want to steer development away from the negative outcome, then it makes sense to try and intervene as early as possible, because that gives you more time for the environment to pull the developmental trajectory away from the negative outcome. So the goal of intervention under this new conception would be to change the environmental conditions as early as possible. Turning to the notion of a neurodevelopmental disorder, so a brain failure of some sort, an obvious goal for research would be to look for the abnormality. Actually, researchers have been looking for abnormalities and have not found any reliable ones for decades. Once we accept that there is no abnormality, there is no specific failure in brain development, but just different brains develop in different ways, and some of them are better suited to learning to read than others, then the goal of research becomes to study this variability in itself. Variability itself becomes a research object. The implications for education are quite different. If you see dyslexia as a neurodevelopmental disorder, then it means that a child with dyslexia is afflicted with a condition. It's an impaired child, a disordered child, that there is something wrong in their head, literally. That's what neurodevelopmental disorder means, that there is a fault in brain development. If you don't see this as something gone wrong, but you see this as different expressions in neural development, then there's no point in seeing this as a condition or even as a unifying label. Instead, you can concentrate on the specific child each time, identify the specific strong and weak areas, and provide support to strengthen the weak areas with help from the strong ones in each case. And finally, related to that, if you believe dyslexia is a natural category, that you either have it or not have it, then it's normal for researchers to ask, what is this? What is the essence of this category? So if dyslexia is something qualitatively specific, then researchers will want to know how it is defined and how it is characterized. If we see it as just an educational label, as something that occurs only because different children have different brains and different abilities and respond differentially to everything. Some children respond better than other children to singing instruction. Some children respond better than other children to skiing instruction. And some children respond better than other children to reading instruction. And in every case, some children do not do very well at all, have great difficulty. However, we live in a literate society that requires all children to learn to read. It's not really so important if some children cannot learn to sing or cannot learn to ski, but it's very important if they cannot learn to read. So we label those dyslexic for the purpose of supporting them, and the goal of research is in finding how they can be helped, how their reading outcomes can improve in the context of their educational system. What can we do that will be effective? And for educators, instead of treating children with dyslexia as having a disease, as a different kind of person, it means that we just contextualize, we assess the strengths and weaknesses of each child in the context of their own situation and guide the appropriate interventions that can best address the interests of this child with its own individual brain, its own individual set of skills and abilities, and the things that they can do well and the things they cannot do so well. So in summary, what I see here is a conceptual shift in how we think of dyslexia from originally seeing dyslexia as a cause of poor reading to increasingly think of it as a name for poor reading. The first one you can see frequently in people, including practitioners, who might say that this child doesn't read well, doesn't spell well because she or he has dyslexia. This makes no sense. It's like saying this child doesn't read well because this child doesn't read well. Dyslexia is not an explanation. Dyslexia is a name for the fact that this child doesn't read well despite having gone to school and having had the same opportunities as every other child her or his age. So conceiving of dyslexia as a name for the problem that some children do not respond sufficiently adequately to reading instruction is a major conceptual shift because it makes it obvious that dyslexia is not something that you have before you go to school and prevents you from learning to read. Dyslexia is something that you are called after you've had some reading instruction and haven't made adequate progress. And more generally, the implications of this conceptual shift for research are that we're not supposed to be looking for abnormalities because there aren't any. We have been looking for abnormalities for decades now, and nothing is replicable. Instead, we are increasingly investigating reading skill as a multifaceted domain that follows a complex, multifactorial developmental course like every other kind of skill, of complex skill that we need to develop. And for education, this new outlook helps us realize that dyslexia is not an excuse and it's also not a diagnosed condition. It's not an excuse in the sense that it's not enough to say, oh, well, you can't read because there's something wrong in your brain. So don't bother trying. Your brain doesn't do it. That's not a constructive approach. And to say it's a diagnosed condition may relieve some people from thinking that they might be responsible or that they might be lazy, but it's still not constructive because it's not a condition. The focus of remedial education is to be on assessing the relevant skills, starting with reading skills, reading related skills, and what is needed in order to build those, and then apply the appropriate personalized intervention, build on the strengths, and go through the prerequisites. So, what do children need to learn in order to learn to read? It's the same for every child, including children with dyslexia, even though children with dyslexia, that is, with reading problems at the word level, require much more intensive effort in this type of instruction in the same sequence and with much lower rate of learning. But still, we have to go from phonological awareness and through decoding on to fluency with intensive and long-term intervention.